All right, we're talking John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, our two British philosophers in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment, and their contributions to the line of thinking that we're sort of running across here as we walk through the Renaissance and Enlightenment. Again, dominated by reason, the rational, and this kind of stuff. As far as the video is concerned, we're going to take John Locke first because he's more familiar to us. He's more closely related to us, especially because of the fact that a lot of his ideas on society and government and stuff like that ends up being formative for founding fathers, United States system of government, that kind of a thing. And so we're going to start with him because he'll sound a little bit more familiar to us, at least initially. But there's a lot in his philosophy that is sort of interesting, and it opens up new veins of thinking on things that we're really familiar with at this point. And so we're going to start with Locke and then make our way to Hobbes. In history, Hobbes comes first, and everything John Locke has to say is in response to Thomas Hobbes. And so hopefully understanding Locke will give you a little bit of an insight as to the roots of Hobbes' thinking, as Locke is sort of counter to Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes, as well as Locke, they're both Christian guys trying to figure out how the Church of England and Christianity, especially in the political life of Britain, makes a lot of sense in the time frame that we're talking about. So, Locke. Human beings are born blank slates. We don't come with any kind of preset knowledge, ideas, concepts, etc. None of that is embedded in us in any way, shape, form, or fashion. We have the capacities for things like creativity and the intellect and stuff like that. So when Locke would talk about sort of image of God sounding things, it would be more about the human capacity and ability to do those things than it is that there's some preset group of knowledge or something like that we're born with. However, this means that for him, we need education more than we need anything else. Because education is the process by which we form our ability to reason well and to learn information that's necessary. Without education, we remain blank slates. And that idea is problematic for him because John Locke is of the opinion that the more we know and can know, the better off life gets for us. So, human beings, blank slates. We don't have any preset knowledge. We need education to help our ability to reason well, to learn well, and honestly, we need it to acquire the information that Locke believes to be most essential. So that still leaves some gaps, and so that's where he kind of goes next. If that's the case, then we're left with a bit of a disconnect, because human knowledge has some limitations, and Locke owns that. There are things that we can know, and then there are things that, well, that are simply beyond our ability to know or understand. And so what we can't discover, information and things discovered, not necessarily invented for Locke, what we cannot discover by the means, practices, methods of reason has to be revealed somehow. Like mathematics. So mathematics is a kind of reason and revelation hybrid. It makes logical, coherent, internal sense. It doesn't contradict itself. On the other hand, math is discovered, not invented. And this is kind of what Locke is talking about. Revelation for Locke is a lot like that. We discover it as we apply reason to certain topics, ideas, concepts, people, etc. All revelation, math and otherwise, has to be rational in order for Locke to even consider it remotely close to true. So reason always gives us an allowance or a space in which truth can be revealed. Revelation itself, information we get from outside sources, from transcendent things. And that's kind of where Locke is going to go with this. That's actually really where Locke is going to go with this. He's going to go straight to the things of theology and God and talk about revelation in that sense. We cannot know these things otherwise. And so reason allows us an acceptance of truth as it comes to us in these various places and spaces. Either because reason is the vehicle by which it's delivered, or reason is the thing that validates the revelation that we're talking about. Revelation for Locke is basically that stuff that we wouldn't be able to know in any other way, shape, form, or fashion, other than somebody gave it to us as a kind of gift. So then he goes on and he clarifies. He says, revelation is in two kinds. One is good, the other not so much. So this is how this works. Number one, original revelation is from God to someone. You or I might talk about this as direct revelation. This material is given directly by God to the writer of the Bible. This is the stuff where Ezekiel says, in my vision I saw these things, or Daniel talks about, in the vision at night I saw this, or John in the text of Revelation who's seeing all this material. This is the stuff that God gave to the writers of the Bible. However, once the writers of the Bible put that stuff down and transmit it to us to communicate what God has communicated to them, it now becomes the second form, which is traditional. And so God direct to the person that we're talking about is original revelation. Traditional revelation is from someone to someone else, like the material that's in the Bible. So what God gives the writers of the Bible is original. What the writers of the Bible produce to give to us is traditional. And Locke says this: original revelation is valid. It's legit because it came from God. Traditional revelation, maybe. Kinda. Perhaps. Sorta. Depends on what we're talking about. Either way, both kinds of revelation have to be rational. They have to possess reason in order for us to even come close to articulating the fact that they are true. Traditional reason falls under the greatest level of scrutiny for Locke. Which means the Bible, in a sense, falls under a great deal of scrutiny and critical thought process for Locke. He's not arguing that the Bible is not true. He's simply saying that the Bible has to stand up to the test of reason. Now that means this: if we go back to our sources and norms, and we have that discussion of what informs our philosophy and theology material, when we talk about scripture, tradition, reason, and experience, and those are the four sort of broad categories we could talk about, Locke puts reason at the top of the pile. Scripture itself has to be reasonable. Locke's belief is God is supremely rational, and so his scripture would have to be as well. And then he launches, kind of from this discussion of revelation and things, into then an issue of toleration. And what he's arguing for is religious toleration, people tolerating religions that aren't necessarily theirs. And his primary concern is a Christian issue in British society. And that Christian issue is the issues between the Anglican Church, the Protestants, and the Catholic Church. So for him, he argues this: the only things worth tolerating from a religious standpoint are the various valid strands of Christian theology. So Buddhism doesn't count, Hinduism doesn't count, Islam doesn't count. Christianity is rational and consists of only a few key doctrines. So here's how that works then. Anybody who confesses these few key doctrines that makes Christianity what it is, that validates it, that etc., 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 their religion is to be tolerated. So if the Protestant understands the Eucharist or baptism or something differently than the Catholic, then the Catholic and the Protestant should tolerate one another, because on the very few things that make Christianity what it is, those two groups actually agree. Well, he's on to something, and he's a little bit off. He's on to something. One, these groups needed to figure out how to get along. Two, Locke underestimates, or oversimplifies rather, just how similar some of these groups really are. However, he is at least advocating for a system and a process that allows these various groups to maintain both their religious independence and find ways to get along with each other. Because we can trust the original revelation, but this second-hand traditional material may be suspect. And so if there's something in someone's theology that Locke says that's not rational, then Locke is going to discard it. Doesn't make sense, doesn't adhere to reason. we get rid of it. So then, Christians should tolerate one another because there's no definitive way to prove exactly who's right on how many fronts until we all get to heaven and see Jesus. So in the meantime, let's just be nice and get along. This is sort of his argument to Christians. All right. That, in a very brief nutshell, is John Locke. So, Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes is all about the human mind and the use of language. So here's what he says. The human mind and use of the language are primarily responsible for ideas and the words we use to communicate those ideas. And so we're going to learn rather rapidly here that Hobbes is a nominalist. 1. Ideas are derived directly or indirectly from what he calls pressure. Basically, it works like this. We take in sensory input. This is a lot like Aristotle, by the way. Something outside of us, something not in the mind, generates some sort of pressure. And that pressure causes an internal process to run its course, which eventually leads us to thought or to emotion or to whatever. Now, given that we're talking about ideas and the mind, it leads to thought. Language. Language is the symbols, words, names, meanings, words, names, symbols, etc., that we attach to the thought in order to communicate its meaning. So it works like this. Language is effectively a system of names. Pencil. The word itself is a symbol for the object. And those names, he argues, are arbitrarily imposed on things. We create the arbitrary system of calling a pencil what it is. And we create it, though, to communicate what the idea is that I need to communicate. So the word itself doesn't necessarily matter as much, so long as the idea being communicated is present. He's working off of a practical consideration and a reality in human life, but this may be pushing things a bit too far to be a nominalist in the way that Hobbes is talking about it. By the way, Charles Darwin is a nominalist, it seems, of the same kind here, and we're going to talk through that later. But Hobbes argues that names or words only signify some meaning that is beyond them in and of themselves. The word or the name itself is not important necessarily because it's arbitrarily assigned. It's the meaning that we need access to. We need to understand what somebody means when they use specific words. And so access to the meaning has a key to unlock what somebody means when they put together a particular sentence in English. And he says that the arbitrary symbols don't matter so much as the arrangement of the symbols to communicate the meaning so we can get at significance. Here, Plato would disagree ardently. No. The words really do have a meaning. And we use those words, not arbitrarily assigned, not haphazardly strewn about English sentences in order to communicate things, but we actually strategically use what is inherently present in the words and the objects and the meanings and the etc. that we create in order to communicate meaning. Hobbes is on the whole other end of the spectrum from that. He's not an absolute thinker in that sense of the word. He's a nominalist. So the words we give it are the words we give it. Great. The words don't matter as much as the meaning matters. Okay. That filters in to here a little bit. He starts a conversation of God, and he says, this is how this works. God is a material being. Now, that for Hobbes does not mean that God is physical like you and I are physical. And it does not mean that God has some sort of tangibility to him. He simply says God is a corporal spirit. He's a spirit. But a spirit isn't actually something that we can comprehend or conceive of in the idea world and the thought world of the mind. And so calling God a spirit actually does more to signify our lack of understanding. And on a positive sense, our reverence for God is a thing that's beyond our ability to understand. In other words, we don't really know what a spirit is. It's like those moments in class when I say, tell me what the soul is. And you're sort of like, well, it's this, I don't know. That's kind of what he's talking about here.
spirit is a catch-all. It's this thing that's not what we are, but that's about as much as we can say about it. We can actually talk more about what it's not than about what it is. So when we talk about God, we express more about what we don't know about God than what we do know about God. For Hobbes, the easiest way to talk about God is to talk about what God is not. Back to, if you remember at the very beginning of the school year, that's back to this apophatic understanding of God, defining something by what it's not. So what do we need? We need a critical approach and a method for understanding the Scripture. We need a critical approach and understanding for reading the Scripture in order to understand words constructed in language that gives us meaning. So it's not about the words specifically used in the Bible. It's about the arrangement of the words that creates meaning in the biblical texts. And so when we study it, we need to understand how the things are arranged in such a way as to communicate the meaning that the writers of the Bible and God needed us to know. The words themselves don't matter. It's the arrangement and the meaning that's created that matters. And so when we do some of this study and interpretive work, Hobbes would argue, you take a look at the original language and as best as you can the intentions that are there, and you start walking your way through that concept, and then you translate by finding the parallel concept and expressing it in words that make sense today. Again, he's a nominalist. That means that it's more important what we say about what God is not than it is important about what we say God is. Because these things are arbitrarily designed, arbitrarily applied. And so the task here is not say the right things in specific words about God. It's say the right meanings about God. And so when we talk about God, we need to express what we mean when we talk about God, not specific words or phrases like all-powerful. No. Hobbes would actually argue that the best way to do that is to make sure that you clearly articulate what it exactly means that you say God is all-powerful, both for you, for God, and for the rest of the world. Okay, this kind of gets us to where we need to be. So, number one, Locke. Everything's based on reason. Everything is subject to reason. Hobbes. There's plenty that's outside our realm of understanding. There's plenty that we can't do, even with specific words and choices. So what we should be aiming at is meaning and significance. How do I say what means something to convey the meaning I need conveyed? And in that regard, Hobbes does a lot to challenge the way that we think here. So, Locke and Hobbes, two British philosophers, opposite ends of the spectrum. Brief introduction and overview here in this video. We can pick up some more with it later.